So in this video, we're going to give a quick introduction to an overview of flight and migration in insects and again why it matters for ecology. This is going to be a very brief overview because this is really a whole field unto itself of thinking about how these organisms are put together and how their sort of movement dynamics are connected to their evolution and ecology. But really just want to start out thinking about the amazing biomechanics and adaptation we really see just in this picture. So think about this dragonfly moving through the air, pumping muscles, being able to sort of control actually four wings at the same time. So in some ways more complicated than our flight machinery, taking in sensory information through its eyes and other modalities, carrying all of its reproductive capacity and energy on board. So, and doing all that with way fewer neurons and at much lower weight than any sort of human-made drones or technology. So kind of an amazing physical and biological phenomenon that is flight. So one question that has fascinated evolutionary biologists and scientists for a very long time is how this amazing adaptation evolved. So where did flight come from? We know that once insects evolved flight, they sort of took off, filled many niches, allowed them to adaptively radiate onto land and opened up a lot of evolutionary potentials. But how did it actually get started? So one of the ideas, roughly, you can think of as sort of the bottom-up idea, is that some kind of existing morphological or physiological adaptations maybe provided some initial advantage for something that became flapping wings. So one of the interesting candidates for this is gills that are present in stoneflies, mayflies, many other groups. So you can see it might be a little small there, but you can see that what they have are these external gills on their abdomen that they actively flap to actually help with water flow and gas exchange. So one idea is that that might have provided the sort of musculature and architecture around flapping that then they get maybe used in the next evolutionary stage to start moving across the water surface, and it basically provided that step-by-step evolution of functionality that will eventually turn into flight. The other general idea we can sort of think of as the top-down idea. So this is an example for some really amazing research that has been going on for years, largely out of Berkeley and other places, but looking at what's called directed aerial descent. And this is, so you see here, this is actually a spider, but it turns out this behavior is really common across just almost all arthropods that they've dropped off of trees. But if you drop an insect or an arthropod from the top of a tree, what they will actually do is, let's see if this loads, is actively maneuver themselves back to the tree and start moving up, and actually use some of the same moves that skydivers move to sort of direct their own fall. And the idea is, falling half of a tree, halfway down a tree is a lot better than falling all the way down, being able to get back up to the food you're eating on, munching on, or your colony. And that might have provided some initial benefit for gliding, some of the behavioral control, and basically some of these precursor adaptations that would allow these insects to then step-by-step evolve flight from gliding. Adding a little bit of flapping can facilitate that. So short answer is we don't actually really know, and we may never know how flight evolved, but there's some interesting hypotheses. What we do know, though, is that over time, the flight machinery of insects has become sort of amazingly well-tuned and changed dramatically over the evolutionary history of insects. So without diving too deep into this, we'll just note that insect flight has some amazing aerodynamics that are actually quite distinct from how airplanes fly. So instead of having, of course, what we call a fixed wing aircraft, so a plane you fly in just getting lift from continuous forward motion, the fact that insect wings flap actually allows them to take advantage of some unique and very distinct aerodynamic mechanisms that aren't possible for large fixed wing aircrafts. And this involves also sort of starting and shedding vortices at the beginning of each up and downstroke as they go back and forth, and some really remarkable aerodynamic mechanisms. architecture of the flight apparatus has also been sort of honed over evolutionary time. And so most of the thorax for flying insects, the entire thorax is usually almost entirely made of flight muscle. It's also been arranged in ways to increasingly sort of pack in more and more flight muscle, so that in most flying insects, you actually have muscles that are attached to, instead of directly pulling on wings per se, what they do is they attach to the whole thorax box in these opposing pairs that either go sort of up, down, or longitudinally within the thorax, and that allows them to pack in a lot of muscle that can then deform the thorax, and then those thoracic deformations actually drive the movement of the wings themselves. So takeaway, really kind of a finely tuned evolutionary machine that is the insect flight apparatus, and some really fascinating physiology and biomechanics just associated with how insects manage to move through the environment. But if we think about the sort of ecology of that, we can think about movement on a couple different scales. And of course, the movement of insects, if you're a plant, for example, you care a lot about the movement of insects, both because that is going to determine whether or not herbivores can find you and consume you, or if you're a flowering plant, maybe you care about attracting pollinators. So the spatial dynamics and how insects move through the environment is ecologically really important. So just one example of what these sort of short-term movements might look like. This is an example from some nice work in recent years using a technique called harmonic radar to actually understand how bees might solve this really challenging and important movement problem, and that's called the traveling salesman problem. So the idea is, if you have a bunch of resources or places that you need to get, what's the shortest distance between those? So how do you most efficiently move between the spots? And it turns out this is actually, even though intuitively simple, this can actually be a bit of a challenging problem to solve sort of computationally, for example. So what these scientists did is tracked a naive individual bumblebee out foraging at these known feeders. And what you can see is in the beginning, the bee is doing a lot of exploration, finding some of the feeders, but also doing a lot of outward movement to other places. But as we watch these bouts develop, so this is over the lifespan of this worker, the multiple foraging bouts, what you're seeing is she is doing more direct connection between flights, isolated or between feeders, and actually sort of converging on an optimal route connecting these feeders. So now you see by the end of, as she's gaining experience, she's becoming really efficient and actually sort of solving this traveling salesman problem. So a lot of active responses to the environment, and bees are sort of continuously actively foraging, trying to find the most efficient way to gather resources, and that is driving patterns of spatial movement within the environment. Beyond those small scale movements, though, of course, a large scale migration is critically important for the ecology, biogeography, and evolution of insects. And there's some amazing examples of long distance migration within insects. One that you may have heard of, it's a bit sort of a classic example, is among monarch butterflies, the seasonal annual migration. So here in North America, for example, the monarchs, at least in the eastern US, actually migrate between, spreading out throughout much of North America, and migrating down in the winter to a particular location in Mexico where they reproduce in these enormously large numbers and actually repopulate the northern latitudes every year. And what's amazing is the monarch butterflies are able to do this, converge on the same location, but over multiple generations. So no individual actually learns or sort of memorizes the route, because this, even within a single year, this occurs over multiple generations. So one generation, say, actually over one generation might do that southward migration, then that butterfly's offspring then start the northern migration. So some amazing examples of long distance migration that is probably in part sort of hard-coded in the ability to navigate to these locations and repopulate. So some very cool sensory and neurobiology there too, in addition to the ecology. But that's actually not the longest migration. As far as we know, the longest insect migration belongs to this dragonfly, Pentala flavescens, which actually migrates between the coast of India and the coast of Africa every year. So enormously long migration that we think is also, they seem to time it with wind, and so using these sort of optimal wind conditions to move across the globe. So an amazing example of a very long distance migration for a small insect. But of course, movement and migration and dispersal are also critically important for practical concerns like pest control. So here's one example in the Colorado potato beetle that we care a lot about here in our local environment, a very important pest of potatoes and other species here in Wisconsin. So one of the interesting things about this pest species, the Colorado potato beetle, is they actually basically spend so much of their mass and investment on reproduction and growing fast and eating. The larvae are kind of these amazing Java-looking grubs that are just eating machines. They actually don't invest a lot in that flight musculature, and at certain stages basically can't fly at all. So they largely disperse by walking. And so that means actually, compared to, say, a bee or that dragonfly we just talked about, their dispersal is quite limited. So they really only disperse maybe up to 500 meters-ish. And so one of the interesting things about that is this mode and distance of dispersal means that certain kinds of control techniques actually work really well. So for example, there's a technique called trenching, where you basically just dig a trench, and then because the beetles don't fly over that, they walk into it and they get caught in that trench. This is an effective control method. Also, crop rotation is really effective in this system, because if you had a population of Colorado potato beetles in one field, if you grow potatoes again in that same field the next year, they might do really well because they don't have to move very far. But if you grow your potatoes just 500 meters away in an adjacent field, then you get quite effective control because they can't actually migrate effectively and colonize those new fields. So crop rotation again in the system is really effective, whereas it might not be in other pest systems. So just some examples, one example of how sort of movement in the environment is actually critically important for population dynamics and even these applied questions of pest control. And we're going to return to, in particular, these ideas when we talk about IPM later in the semester, and also when we think a little bit about an idea called metapopulations. So this view of how insects move through environments is going to come back through this semester.